99.8 KCFM
Podcast.
Terry Dolan, good evening.
Good evening, Matthew.
Good to see you. Let's face it, there are 1,000 things we could talk about. We could probably fill hours and hours. But a basic question I want to start with. Do you think you were controversial?
Not particularly, no. I didn't feel myself as I was controversial, but let's just say the way things finished, it probably ended up being controversial.
Because we'll go into the rights and wrongs in due course. Football fans do have long memories, though, don't they?
Sometimes they have long memories, sometimes they have short memories, but, you know, from my point of view, it was 6.5 years, certainly from an educational point of view. It wasn't as successful as I'd have liked, but, you know, that's how the world is at times.
Well, we've got plenty, like I say, that we can go through, and we will, between now and 8 o'clock. But let's start at the beginning. You had a memorable spell at Bradford, which nearly resulted in promotion. I remember it well. You had that side that made stars of Stuart McCall and John Hendry, amongst others. They got their big moves. It was that period of your life which helped you get the job at Boothferry Park in the first place, wasn't it?
I don't know, is that right? I mean, I went from...
That was your biggest success to that point.
Yes, I mean, that was they were the 2 years where initially I had success as you know, my first job in management. And yeah, we just missed out in the playoffs to get into the top league. Lost to Middlesbrough in the playoffs. And not for the first time in my career, the ownership of the club changed at Bradford. And the new chairman wanted somebody of his own to bring in, and that was one of the reasons why I ended up leaving Bradford. I then went to Rochdale, and on the strength of what I'd done at Bradford, Rochdale were, you know, keen to have me go there. And in the 2 years I was at Rochdale, we turned the fortunes around there as well. And that's when Hull came calling.
It took a while for Hull to come calling, though, because Stan Ternent lost his job after a bad defeat at Portsmouth on New Year's Day 1991, and you weren't appointed till the 30th of January. It did take quite a long time. I mean, was it a long process? Were you interviewed fairly quickly after the vacancy came, and then were you left sort of waiting? Well,
I think, for those who can remember, I'd been told by the chairman at Rochdale that if another club came in for me, that was going to be a better club, then I could go and talk to them. And when Hull approached me, the chairman then changed his mind and wouldn't let me speak to them.
So was it only a gentleman's agreement? You had nothing written down?
No, there was nothing written down, but I mean, I wasn't worried about that. But it worked out then that I had to resign from Rochdale in order to speak to Hull. So that's probably what...
the delay was?
Yeah, took the delay, yeah.
Okay.
Caused the delay, yeah.
City were very isolated at the bottom of the second tier at the time. Did you hope to save the club from relegation that season, or did you think it was already a lost cause?
No. It was in my mind that's, you know, I came to the club in the hope that we could stay up, but unfortunately that wasn't the case. I mean, it was ironical that I took over from Stan Ternent, who'd been my assistant when I was manager at Bradford. But between January, or the end of January and the end of the season, we just didn't win enough games to, you know, to stay in the division.
You mentioned Stan Ternent, as you said, you took over from him and he'd previously been your assistant. He spent a lot of money in his 18 months or so at the club. Did he actually spend your money, in a way? Because the received wisdom, and it's been confirmed by the guys who were in charge at the time, that he spent far too much. Did he actually spend the money that otherwise you might have got over the next, say, year or two?
Well, I didn't come to the club on the proviso that I had a lot of money promised to me to spend. You know, I came in the hope that I could make the club a better club. But unfortunately, since the middle 60s, the Needler family had been sort of bankrolling the club. And it was just around about that time that the Needle family decided that enough was enough and the chequebook was closed, basically.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the Needler family would not relinquish control of the club in their shareholdings, but at the same time wouldn't hand over any cash. And it was catch-22, wasn't it?
Well, as it turned out, in the long run, that was the start of the long, slippery slope. Of which I was a part of for most of the time.
So we had that relegation in 1991. But people, I think, had been looking to the next season anyway, and among your recruits in that next season was Dean Windass, of course. Now, given that he'd been released as a kid by Brian Horton at Hull City, did this make taking a risk on him easier second time round, on the understanding that you didn't think he would let a second chance slip?
Not particularly, because I wasn't really aware of him having had a chance initially. I'd had scouts watching him at North Ferriby. I was told to have a look at him myself. We invited him down to training one Monday morning at Costello Park, and after 20 minutes I decided that I'd seen enough and offered him a contract straight away.
Fair enough.
You know, he was such a good player, and he had so much ability compared to the players that we had.
So it was only after you offered him a deal that you found out that he'd actually been slipped through the net as a teenager.
Yeah.
Did that surprise you, or is it a case that a lot can happen in sort of those 3 or 4 years?
Yeah, I mean, physically, I think he developed a lot in those interim period, or in that interim period. He was obviously working on a building site, which didn't do him any harm. But the other contributing factor was I knew that Sunderland were desperate to sign him. And they ummed and ahed. Dennis Smith was the manager at Sunderland. They were umming and ahhing as to whether to make an offer to take him up for a trial.
That's good scouting, though, isn't it, for Sunderland to know about a kid at North Ferriby?
Yeah.
That's a sign that your scouting system's working.
Yeah. So I decided I needed to jump in quickly, and I backed my own judgment, and the rest is history, as they say.
You also got Alan Fettis in, so you had scouts working out in Northern Ireland as well. Your 2 major successes in the transfer market for that opening full season that you had, and neither of them cost anything.
I think Alan Fettis cost a small fee. But
with the best will in the world, it's next to nothing, isn't it? In terms of it's not going to cause a huge dent in whatever transfer budget you did have.
Yeah, well, I mean, as we go along chronologically, you'll find that we've signed very few players for money.
Indeed. So one particular occasion where it was the supporters' money that you used, and we'll come to that. So the 1992 season came along. It was inconsistent. You finished 14th. There were some good victories and some appalling defeats as well. And you used a lot of players. Was it a case of constantly juggling the squad and trying to keep players interested for long enough?
It was. I mean, don't forget we'd had the bad season the season before where, the team was relegated. We'd lost players like Peter Swan, who was sold to Port Vale.
Did you have any say in that, or did you want to keep Peter Swan?
I wanted to keep him, but Peter wanted to go.
Okay.
And I think after that season where we did get relegated, he didn't want to play in a lower division. And then obviously after Peter Swan we sold Andy Payton. And I mean,
just about 3 months into that season, yeah.
Andy Payton was the first one that we had to sell basically because of the financial problems.
Indeed, yeah, I remember it well, and he remained the record sale for quite some time, right up until when Leon Court went to Crystal Palace recently. You played Chelsea in the FA Cup that season. I've always, maybe this is just my prejudices in football, I don't know, but I've always felt quite cheated that we were beaten thanks to goals from Vinnie Jones and Dennis Wise.
Well, to be honest, I can't remember much about that. If I do remember correctly, I think Stan Turnham was on the coaching staff at Chelsea at that time.
I couldn't say, but certainly that was how it finished, 2-0, and those were the 2 guys that scored. It wasn't anything like the Chelsea that we know now. I think it was in this season as well where you had David Norton in, and there was a problem in trying to make his loan deal into a permanent deal, and I remember the whole Daily Mail saying something like it could have been as little as a tenner that made the difference, that could have made the difference.
I don't think it was to such a degree. As far as I can remember, we had him on loan and I wanted to sign him permanently. And eventually Martin Fish, persuaded the bank to say, look, whatever it was that we had to pay for him, let us have him because we needed him.
And he ended up being ever present in the midfield that season, and a couple of games at right back. The 93 season was again a little disappointing. Finished at 20th, and it actually ended with 4 straight defeats. Were you feeling any pressure by this stage? Because you'd had 2 seasons having been relegated, albeit many people would say that the relegation, although you said you tried to keep the club up, the relegation could have been your fault or could have been down to Stan Turnham. But the 92 and 93 seasons were both bottom half finishes. The second one was a relegation battle that you managed to get out of. Were you starting to feel any pressure?
Not pressure as such, because there were so many other things going on behind the scenes, and we tried to keep it away from the general public as much as possible. When I say things going on behind the scenes, the bank were putting pressure on. It was a case of we were having to sell players, and in order to sell players, we had to find them for nothing to start with. And as you say, people like Alan Fettis ended up going. Then Dean Windass ended up going eventually. We sold the likes of Russ Wilcox, Gary Hobson for not great fees, but we still sold them for fees because money had to come in.
Indeed.
Because of the fact that the team wasn't particularly doing well in the leagues, the crowds were starting to dwindle as well. So.
You mentioned Alan Fettis, yeah, you sold him. He played the first sort of 15 or so games of that season, then he left, and yes, that was the season that Gary Hobson went as well. It was also the season when, for the first time of what felt like many thousand times, you signed Gary Lund on loan, and he just kept coming back, didn't he? Was there no way you could get him permanently?
No, because Grimsby wanted a transfer fee for him. And
it was as straightforward and as simple as that?
Yeah.
And it's business, isn't it,
Well,
ultimately?
yeah, I mean, if you think one of the seasons where we had Ian Ormeroyd on loan, we had Gary Lund on loan, we had Ray Wallace on loan, we had Warren Joyce on loan, and that was the season where we felt that we had a decent team.
Yeah.
We had them for as long as we could keep them on loan, and then that was it. They had to go back because we just couldn't afford to buy them.
It was also that season, 92-93, and I think it was by accident initially that you made Dean Windass into a striker. I mean, was there always the plan to... we'd seen some evidence when he was playing in midfield that he could score goals, but was it just purely out of necessity that you put him up front?
Very much so, yes. He was such a skillful player that, he was one of these players who we said, well, if we feel we've got a weakness in that position, we'll put Dino there. Dino was keen to play wherever he could to help the club, and we ended up putting him together with Linton Brown.
Okay.
And they formed a terrific partnership.
Yes, and Linton Brown was on this programme only last week, now that in his job as a KCFM pundit. Got a question on the email from Jim Campbell, who's listening online in Bristol. He says, Terry, under the circumstances that existed at the time, I'm not sure anyone could have done a, quote, good job managing City, but I'd like to know if you're proud of your time and your achievements at Hull.
Yes, I am, because at the bottom line is that the club survived. And in a lot of circumstances or a lot of situations, the club could have folded. When I say fortunate, we were fortunate that we had enough players that we could sell. Had we not had the players who we could sell, then I'd hate to think what would have happened to the club.
Terry, I am a Hull City supporter, and I was there. And I know plenty of Hull City supporters that I've travelled to games with up and down the country for quite a few years. They've all got accusations to make about your time. I'm going to go through them, and this is your opportunity to confirm, deny, clarify, whatever it might be. Okay?
Fine.
Okay.
Fire away.
Accusation number one. You refused to pick Lee Palin despite his obvious skills because you didn't get on when you were his manager at Bradford.
Incorrect.
It is fair to say you dropped him pretty much as soon as you arrived at the club.
Yeah, but that wasn't because I didn't like him.
Okay.
I mean, I'll just give you some background to the Lee Palin situation. Before I became manager of Bradford, I went to watch him 4 or 5 times when Trevor Cherry was manager, and I recommended that Trevor sign Lee Palin.
Was this when he was back at Aston Villa? Oh, Nottingham Forest.
He was at Notts Forest, yeah.
Right.
And you could see straight away the ability he had. And then, obviously, when Trevor left, I became caretaker manager and then became manager, so he was part of the squad. But at that time, we had people like Stuart McCall, Mickey Kennedy I signed, and Lee Palin found himself not a regular in the team. But he was part of the squad for those 2 years, and a squad that did very, very well.
Okay.
So, I can dismiss that one straight away.
All right, well, can I just ask the counter question then? What did go wrong with Lee Palin once you arrived at Hull City? Because he was a very skillful presence in the side, and it did seem to happen quite quickly that once you came in, his place in the side was far more in doubt than it ever was under Stan Ternent.
Yes, but I think you have to look at the fact that we weren't doing well as a team, and Lee was a certain type of player, a cultured player, but the downside was he wasn't the hardest working player, and we needed players who could work hard at that time. Okay.
The $750,000 received for Andy Payton should have been a hell of a lot more.
Possibly, but that was the deal that we ended up doing, and as I say, that was the first one we did, basically, to avoid a winding up order.
Did you... I know that when it comes to finances, it was obviously more down to, or certainly as much down to the boardroom as it was down to the management team, but did you have any say in terms of who was sold and how much for? Were you asked your opinion, or did the board do their own work on that?
No, the board basically said, look, we've got to sell players, and we've got to get whatever we can for the players who have got a value.
Okay.
Which, is... As on one side of management, you don't want to lose your best players, but the other side of management is that you've got to make sure that the club continues to run. And that was part of the reason, not just with Andy Payton, but with 4 or 5 other players after that. And I can assure you, it hurt me tremendously. But I had to make a decision as the manager, along with the directors, what's the best for the club.
It took 15 years for that fee to be broken as a record sale. It was a hell of a sale. Next accusation, that you badly misjudged the extent of Wayne Jacobs' knee injury and the player was treated poorly by the club.
Well, regarding badly judged his injury, we were told that he wouldn't play for quite some time, And again, this was at the end of a season where we'd not been very successful. We had to make even more cuts for the start of the following season, and we couldn't afford to give a contract. His contract was up. We couldn't afford to give a contract to a player who wasn't fit. It was as simple as that. We didn't expect Wayne to recover that quickly, but full marks to the boy because he went on and he's played, so many more games. I mean, I'm delighted for him in that respect, but again, it was pure economics. He wasn't fit as a player. We couldn't afford to give him a contract.
Did you expect him to recover at all? I mean, did you think his career was over?
The diagnosis initially was that he will do well to play again. But, as I say, from Wayne's point of view, full marks to him because he did play. And
when he ended up playing again, he went to Rotherham and then, of course, climbed the divisions with Bradford, ended up as a Premier League left-back with Bradford. I mean, that must have given you some heart, I suppose, but also at the same time must have made you really regret things as well.
Yeah, you regret losing a player who's got ability, but, in other circumstances, had we had the money, we would have given him a new contract in the hope that he did recover.
OK, next one. The quality of football on show during the majority of your period was, this is a kind expression, rather industrial, to say the least. It was, you did play very much a long ball game.
Again, I beg to differ on that. Okay. I'm not going to argue, but my philosophy is that, if you're going to score goals, you want the ball in the opponent's half most of the time. There's no point in... And to be honest, we didn't have the players who could pass the ball around silkily and play exciting, sexy football, as they call. We just didn't have the players to do it. We had one or two individuals who had a lot of ability, and that's why we ended up selling them. But if I'm regarded as a manager who just relied on the long ball game, then I would be a little bit upset about that.
I remember once reading an interview with Dave Bassett, and he was basically accused of being a long ball merchant, as the expression goes, and he says, well, he admitted it and said, you play to win. And he said the best way to win, in my view, is to get the ball in the opposition half as quickly as possible. But do you accept that sometimes it can make a midfield redundant?
Well, it can do in that respect, but, Matthew, football is such a game that if the team's winning, nobody's interested in what sort of football they're playing. They want to see the team win.
Results first, performances later.
Yeah, if the team's not doing well, then people will look at the reasons why they're not doing well.
Okay.
And sometimes the style of football is, not an excuse, but a reason that's thrown at people.
Okay. As I said, these are accusations that Hull City fans I've heard over the years and read and so on about your time in charge, and I'm just giving you the chance to put your side.
I can understand them thinking that way because we didn't have the success that we all wanted.
Okay. The next one. Too much faith was shown in Chris Lee, leading to accusations of nepotism because he was your assistant's son. Not
really. Chris came on a free transfer. He was a hard-working player who people probably didn't give him the credit he deserved. And he was one of these players who, when he wasn't in the team, you knew that he was missing. But at the end of the day, I was the one who released him.
Okay. Next one. Again, this is going back to the Andy Payton one, I suppose, that the £600,000 received for Dean Windass in 1995 also was nowhere near enough. I must say, I was disappointed with that. I thought we'd get twice as much, frankly, with the record he had in a team that wasn't playing greatly, although he'd had a couple of challenges for the playoffs and the level that City were playing at. I must say I was disappointed by that amount of money. Yeah, I think it was 650 actually, not 600, but the scenario there was, and I think Dean mentioned it in his book, that initially he thought he was going to go to Norwich because Martin O'Neill wanted to sign him at Norwich. That fell through because Robert Chase, the chairman, decided that they weren't going to spend that money. Excuse me, and we'd been negotiating with Norwich for quite some time, and Dean was aware of it. The Aberdeen one came out of the blue, but they offered the money straight away, and again there was another winding up order in the offing, and it was a case of, well, we've got to take it. Do you think you actually held on to him longer than you expected? I mean, he didn't leave until midway through the relegation season of 95-96, and his consistency had got 17 in his last full season. He'd got 4 in 16 in that season before he left. He got 23 the year before, and then in his first season as a striker, well, it didn't go so well for him, but I think he was only put in halfway through as a striker. He got 7. So there were a lot, certainly for 2 of those seasons, there were a lot of goals in the offing. Were you surprised that you held on for him as long as you did? We possibly did, or possibly yes, because, as I say, after the Norwich thing fell through, Dean was very upset because he thought that was his one chance of a move gone completely.
But to be fair to him, he stuck at it, and as I say, the Aberdeen thing came out of the blue. I mean, even when he moved to Aberdeen, I didn't want him to go because I knew how important he was to us as far as the team's concerned. But again, the money was needed, and he had to go.
Do you, at any point at all, because I asked Brian Horton about when he sold Gary Parker, which he says he regretted and was possibly a catalyst to the slump in form which led to his departure back in 1988, and he said, looking back, he shouldn't have sold him. Now, I know that finances were a different matter back then. It was a much easier time to be manager at Hull City. But when you... Do you think that if Dean Windass had hung around for that little bit longer, he would have actually made the difference in relegation or otherwise? Because in the end, you went down by some distance. It was a long way after the bottom of the table. Do you think he could have made that much difference if he'd stayed?
No, I don't think one person can make that much difference, to be honest. And we owed it to Dean. You know, he'd done enough for us over the time he was there. We owed it to him to allow him to go and further his career.
OK. There's only 2 more of these. OK. The next one. That you should have declined the 3-year contract offered to you in 1996 after relegation.
Why should I have declined that?
Well, that's the accusation. I'm giving you the opportunity to say why you shouldn't.
Well, no, because I was working under the pretext that we had to keep the club running, we had to get players in for nothing and try and sell them on.
Do you accept it's unusual to be offered a 3-year deal after relegation to the bottom division?
I accept it's unusual because of the relationship I had with Martin Fish,
which was obviously very strong, and we know how strong it was.
Yeah.
Did you expect it? Maybe it was the 3 years rather than the offer of a contract per se. It's quite a long contract after a relegation.
Yeah, but I think Martin, even at that stage, Martin was still looking at the longer-term picture of the club, in the hope that, you know, we could get through the bad times financially and then start to build from a better base. But that never happened.
Were you out of contract that year?
No.
You weren't. So you still had some time left on a... Was it a concurrent contract? Was it gonna... Did it start straight away, the new contract, or did it start at the end of your existing one?
No, I think I had a year to run on my old one.
Right.
And then it was extended by another 2 years.
Right, OK. And the last one I've got on this list here, that you received a commission on transfer fees that came into the club.
Well, I mean, on anything like that, anything contractually, I've always felt that everything in those terms is confidential. So I can't go into details like that. But what I can say is that I think if you look around the lower divisions and the managers' contracts, it's quite often the case where managers, in a way of encouraging to get players for nothing and sell them on, they do have clauses in the contracts where they may get a percentage of any sale over a certain figure.
What was the most you ever spent on a player then?
Most I ever spent?
And I'm not going to count Linton Brown because it wasn't your money, or it wasn't in your budget, it came from the supporters. I mean, did you ever get a transfer budget which you could... This is for spending on players, Terry?
No, never.
So you had to go cap in hand every time somebody came up, presumably?
Yeah. Well, the case we talked about earlier, Ormond Royd, Lund, Wallace and Joyce.
Yeah.
You know, we couldn't afford to buy any one of them. I think I paid money for David Norton eventually.
Yeah.
And I think when I say the club paid 40,000 for Warren Joyce, I believe.
Okay.
Not much more was spent on anybody else in 6.5 years.
Well, did the lack of money make it harder for you to renew? I mean, I look at somebody like David Mayle, who gave you some really good service, but he was signed on a reasonable wage because he was signed by Stan Ternant when the money for wages was available. Was it hard to renew contracts for players like that, who clearly had the club at heart, but obviously were not entirely keen on taking a pay cut?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's one of the problems that you have in management, and you've got to sort of weigh things up as to whether that player is... Well, you're going to offer him less if you've got less money to work with on a budget, but if a player says no and he's got a chance to go somewhere else, then he's going to go somewhere else. But, you know, players were on reasonable wages when I joined the club, and from the point of view of average wages, it went down rather than up.
Yeah, okay.
Which is, you know, something I didn't want. I would have preferred to give everybody more money. But we didn't have it. It was as simple as that. Okay.
Terry Dolan is with us. I think after that list of accusations, it's quite a harsh word. To be honest with you, I just couldn't think of another one. Terry, the 94 and 95 seasons, those 2 seasons were really encouraging. Why ultimately did City just fall short of the playoffs on both occasions?
Obviously because we just weren't quite good enough. And again, you know, things tended to go against us. We had, as I say, one or two decent players. We were a difficult unit to beat, but we just didn't get to that final hurdle, or get over that final hurdle.
Given that the club was skint, you had no transfer budget, you were relying on free transfers and starlets from non-league, as it were, the best players from local non-league. Did you surprise yourself, and were you proud of yourself?
Again, it was a catch-22 situation, because we wanted to push on, and we needed to sort of build with the squad that we had, but we just, people listening will probably think, oh, it's the same old story, that no money. Well, we didn't have any money. We couldn't get that better quality player, which was the difference that was needed to go from being just outside the playoffs to get into the playoffs to go up automatically. And it was, I'll tell you something, from my point of view, it was very, very frustrating, or from everybody on the staff's point of view, it was very, very frustrating, because we knew we weren't far away.
Okay. Do you think, I mean, this is a question that kind of has the benefit of hindsight, I suppose. It may be unfair, but I'll ask it anyway. You can always not answer it. But do you think if promotion had occurred in either of those, then the financial situations of the club would have been improved greatly for the club to actually make the sort of progress it's ended up making in recent years? Do you think you were one promotion away from the club being better from top to bottom?
Not initially, no. I think it would have taken more than that. But we needed to stem the flow of, the downward spiral. And from a financial point of view, we just couldn't do it.
Because you might recall, of course, about 3 years after you left, Brian Little took the club into the playoffs from the bottom division, and never mind the club was skint, the club half the time had nowhere to play or train because of David Lloyd's antics with the padlocks.
Yeah.
I mean, did you sort of empathise with the situation that Brian Little was in at that time?
Very much so. I mean, if you think of the time from when I left until Adam Pearson came, effectively, it was very, very difficult. I mean, Warren Joyce, who took over after Mark Haitley, he had all on to just keep the club going himself. And it was sad to see at that stage. But fortunately, as I say, Adam Pearson came, the new ground changed everything.
It did.
But it was also not the fact that it was just the new ground, but the team happened to gel at the same time, and the team being successful coincided with moving to the KC, and then, things have just gone on from there.
Some remarkable games during those 2 years, winning 4-3 at Cardiff, 4-4 draw at home to Barnet, and a very famous 7-1 win over Crewe, which was immediately after Rach Carter's death, and there was a reaction as a consequence. It was an incredibly unpredictable time, wasn't it?
Very much so. I'm trying to think, the other game that sticks in my mind, the cup tie against Whitby. Was that year, or was that the following year, or the year before?
That was in your last year, I think. It was 96,
right.
97. I will come to that.
We'll come to that later. Okay. Yeah.
But certainly those three league games. I mean, the 7-1 over Crewe. I mean, actually, it was on a reasonable run at the time. A win away at Shrewsbury the previous week, and a 2-2 draw at Wrexham, beating Blackpool at home, beating Bournemouth at home. So you were on a good run, and then in the midst of this good run, you go and tonk 7 past Crewe, who finished third that year.
Yeah, I mean, the game against Crewe stands out, obviously, because of the scoreline. And when you think that, I mean, people who saw that game, we played some unbelievable football in that game, particularly against a team who were renowned as a pure football team as well. But it's going back to what we were talking about earlier. What's the best type of football? The best type of football is the football that wins your football matches. And Crewe have always gone from one division to another, playing exciting football, but they'll get promoted one minute, they get relegated the next minute. And they weren't the strongest spine in the world as far as a football team were concerned. So, although it was a shock to score 7, we deserved it on that occasion. But we had young players in the team then. People like Neil Mann had come in from non-league, Richard Peacock had come in, Jimmy Graham, all relatively young, and that was hopefully going to be the base to build from. But again,
it was a settled side. I mean, I think that was within a sequence of about 7 or 8 undefeated, included within that were 4 straight wins. 3 for Linton Brown that day, 2 for Dean Windass, and 1 each for Rob Dewhurst and Richard Peacock. The previous year, Runcorn, when that wall collapsed, what angle were you at? What did you see And what did you think had happened?
Again, don't remember too much about it, apart from the fact that the game was abandoned. I think, actually, at the time, we couldn't understand what had happened. And then, eventually, when everything calmed down, you just thought, well, should we have played the game at Runcorn in the first place? Was the stadium suitable enough for a game, in the FA Cup? Because it was an FA Cup game, wasn't it?
It was, yeah, first round of the FA Cup, and
we eventually ended up playing at
Northwich.
Was it Northwich?
Northwich, Wincham Park, and winning 2-0. I do believe it was the only goal, bless him, that Chris Hargreaves ever scored in about 4 years with Hull City. But yes, eventually won the game 2-0 and then went out in the second round to Chester.
I mean, going back to Chris Hargreaves, that was another example of us not having too much luck. We signed Chris Hargreaves in the summer from Grimsby, and he broke his leg before the season has even started, because we'd signed Chris to play with Steve Moran, who we thought was going to be a reasonable strike pairing. And it didn't work out.
That was his only goal, bless him. I mean, he actually scored
He's still playing.
He's still playing, isn't he? He's nearly 40 now, and he's scoring. He scored a few goals for Northampton. Now he played for Plymouth for a while as well, because I think half the Plymouth side had really long hair like him at the time.
He's playing in the conference, I believe, now.
28 games in that 93-94 season without a league goal. He did score in the FA Cup in the rearranged game against Runcorn. 21 games without a goal the following year and didn't score in any of the cups. A remarkable record for all the wrong reasons, obviously. What about picking Alan Fettis as an outfield sub? I mean, I know your hands were tied in terms of it's just the number of players that you had available. And that famous instruction, do you remember what it was? Because Alan Fettis has talked about it and it's been quoted so many times.
Just go out and score.
I think it was go out and make a nuisance of yourself. You didn't expect him to score, surely?
No, it was Dennis Smith was the manager, wasn't it?
It was home to Oxford, December the 17th, 1994.
Yeah, Dennis Smith was the manager. I think we were winning 2-1 and he ended up getting the third goal.
He did, correct, yeah.
And I'll never forget Dennis Smith's face after the game. He came up to me and he said, I won't swear on air, but he said, that's the most embarrassing moment of my managerial career.
Was it worth... it was obviously worth doing. He scored, but before the game, did you actually toy with just not picking enough subs?
No.
Rather than putting a goalkeeper as an outfield sub?
Players will tell you, goalkeepers in training always think that they can score goals and that they're the best strikers in the world. Unfortunately, Alan had a problem with his shoulder, so there was no way that he could keep goal. But we were so short of players at that time that I put him on the subs bench, and as I say, he ended up going on. But I mean, that was one goal he scored, but the best one was the one at the end of the season when he scored at Blackpool.
When you actually started him as a striker, which is even more...
Because again, with no strikers fit. It was probably the worst game in the world that day as well at Blackpool, and Sam Allardyce was the manager at Blackpool, and he said something similar to Dennis Smith after that game.
But you see, what intrigues me is that you were allowed, I think, 2, possibly even 3 subs back then, but he was the only sub you brought on. I mean, how much must the other players on the bench, I don't know who they were, because my records only give subs who actually got on. But how must the other players who were on the bench that day must have felt when you chose to put a goalkeeper on ahead of them to play outfield? because Alan was capable of being a striker, the other players weren't. Honestly, it is bizarre, isn't it? I mean, he's dined out on that for years as Alan Fettis. He's been on this programme and talked about it. There was always a claim during this period that your chairman, Martin Fisher, was completely powerless when it came to the finances, and that Christopher Needler, as major shareholder, could have released some money. There was money, not necessarily available, but there was money in existence within the club that could have gone into a transfer budget, but Mr. Needler wouldn't do so.
No, there was never money available, unfortunately.
Do you think that the shareholders could have helped more? Because the chairman and the chairman's hands were tied.
When you say the shareholders, what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, what I've, just from what I've heard and what I've read, is that there was money available from the people who actually had shares in the club could have invested more in the club in order to give you some money to spend.
I was never aware of that, and as far as I was concerned, we had to get our own finances.
Did you shout
by selling players.
Did you shout and scream ever? I mean, did you ever go into the chairman's office or anybody else's office and say, "Look, just help, give me some money. There must be something somewhere. We must be able to do something to get a player in here and there." Did you ever have to try and put your foot down and have a tantrum about it?
No, but maybe that was one of my faults. Maybe I should have done.
Do you think it might have worked?
But I doubt it.
Okay.
I think they were set in their ways, and when you have a family who have spent that much money on the football club and they've decided that enough's enough, then you've got to accept that.
When the fans supplied the money to buy Linton Brown, let me just clarify this. You chose Linton Brown and then the fans supplied the money to buy him. So, first of all, did that put extra pressure on you to make sure you got the right man this time, because it wasn't even the club's money that you were spending? And also, did it also make you wonder exactly what sort of club Hull City had become, where the fans were supplying your transfer budget?
Yeah, I mean, that wasn't nice, because obviously when I came to the club I didn't expect the club to be in the situation it was so many years later. As far as putting extra pressure on, not really, because I always had confidence in my own ability as to picking a player, and that never worried me.
During those 2 seasons, 94-95, where you flirted with the playoffs but didn't quite make it, what was the relationship generally like between you and the supporters?
And difficult to say. I mean, I never looked upon it as having... I mean, I'm pretty laid back. I'm a guy who can, just get on with my job. I'm not flamboyant, so maybe the supporters wanted somebody who would shout his mouth off and, be flamboyant. Well, unfortunately, I'm not that type of character. And I would never change my character. So, in that respect, maybe the supporters didn't take to me from that point of view. But, to be honest, Matthew, I was so enveloped in the job I was doing, in trying to make sure that we kept the club going, that I never gave that too much of a thought, to be honest.
Question from Chris on the text. He said, Bradford and Huddersfield both came sniffing after you after the second of those 2 playoff seasons. How close were you to leaving at that stage, and do you now regret not going to either?
Well, it's easy in hindsight to say, yes, I should have gone, but...
I was working in Huddersfield at the time. I certainly remember after Neil Warnock quit following their playoff victory that they were very interested in you, weren't they?
Yes, they were, but I owed it to Martin Fish to be loyal to him. And maybe some people will say, well, that was a mistake I made. But, again, that's the type of guy I am. He was loyal to me, I wanted to be loyal to him.
Did you speak to them?
No.
No, okay. No. 1996 was a tough time for everybody, of course. And it's the worst that many City fans had experienced at that stage. Worse, obviously, would still come. Only 5 wins in 46 league games. Was it as tough an experience for you as it was for those of us who were watching?
Very much so, and I think it was tough for the players as well, because, the situation got to a stage where, even for the players, they could see that, there was only going to be one answer, and eventually it happened. And that was only because David Lloyd came in and bought the club. I mean, if you look back, the club was there to be taken over for quite some time, and the takeover eventually from David Lloyd took about 6 or 8 months longer than it should have taken. So it was, it was a slow torture, if anything, for everybody concerned. Relegation
was confirmed long before the end of that season, but still relations got worse with that Bradford game at the end. Did you prepare yourself for a bad day that day? With the the decision to rehouse the fans had caused a lot of consternation, of course, and Bradford's own situation as well.
Well, I mean, Bradford they needed to win to get into the playoffs or get promotion. The police were the people that had the final say as to what happened from a crowd point of view. But to be honest, from my point of view, all I was concerned about, we were playing against one of my former clubs, and I wanted to make sure that we won that game.
And it finished 3-2 to Bradford, didn't it, on the day? Goals for Gordon and Dwayne Darby. 8-4 against Whitby. You mentioned it earlier. That was the 96-97 season after you dropped into the bottom division. That last season, I mean, you had the 8-4 against Whitby, Dwayne Darby scoring 6 goals. You had Roy Carroll again, another player who went for a lot less than he was worth, and you only have to look at his career that followed. But you seemed to get more defiant that year, and sometimes it started to get ugly and nasty at times, didn't it?
It did. I mean, the Whitby game in particular, I can tell you one thing that I'll never forget that happened in that game, and we were 4-3 down with a minute to go at home. And somebody behind the south stand had been ejected from the ground, and the stewards and the police walked him past the dugout and just as he's walking past the dugout, we equalised to make it 4-4. And again, without swearing on air, this guy looked at me and turned round and he said, "You lucky so-and-so, Dolan, that's kept you your job."
Was he right?
I don't think so.
Would you have gone if you'd lost to Whitby? Would you have quit?
No.
Okay.
No.
What was the closest you ever came to leaving? I mean, sometimes it must have got hard for you.
No.
Never?
No, believe it or not, no. Because I always felt that, given the right sort of ammunition, I could do a good job.
Eventually you did leave, of course, when the ownership changed. Although, as I recall it, the paperwork didn't quite go through properly, which meant that Martin Fish still had to recall you to take pre-season training, even though you probably both knew that it was going to be only a question of a day or two before you were both not going to be connected with the club anymore.
Yeah, I was summoned to my office on a Saturday morning, the Saturday before pre-season started on the Monday, by Tim Wilby, who was Mr. Lloyd's right-hand man, so to speak.
Yep, former Hull FC player.
He informed me that the time was up and they were making changes. But they'd done that without having actually signed the takeover. So I was called back into the club on the Monday to take training. Martin Fish said, "Well, once the takeover's done, you don't have to come in again," and I ended up taking training for that following week, one day after another.
Were you sad to go?
Very sad, yeah.
Were you also, in a way, relieved?
No, because I felt that I hadn't finished the job. So it was never relief, because I was disappointed that it ended the way it did. The last 12 months were very difficult from a certain point of view. We talked about, you were going to mention the thing at Torquay where... Yeah,
you got the Dolan out sticker put on your head and you didn't notice straight away, did you?
Well, I did, but I didn't want anybody else to know that I did notice.
So you waited until half-time and quietly took it off in private?
Correct. But, I can laugh at it now.
A decade on, it's amusing, isn't it?
It is, but what would have happened had it been something else other than a sticker?
Of course. We've run out of time, Terry, but thank you for coming in. Just very, very briefly, what have you made of the recent successes?
Absolutely fantastic. With my job now, assessing referees in the Premier League, I've not seen as many games as I would like. Hopefully I'll see one or two more next season, but I just think that the supporters in particular, over the last few years, have had plenty to shout about. Nothing better than what happened at the end of last season, but let's hope that's only the start.
Thank you for coming in, and
You're
best
welcome.
of luck with your work with the LMA and as a referee's assessor as well, and it's good to see you.
Thank you.
Appreciate you coming in. Terry Dolan with us on Sports Call tonight, and Les Hare, chairman of North Ferriby United, is here tomorrow.